I spent my life trying not to lose. Not failing. Not falling apart. Not being left behind. Just, not losing. 10 seconds into this confession, here is the truth I avoided admitting for years: I didn't build my life around desire. I built it around fear of loss. I watched people gamble everything on dreams, relationships, identities, and I told myself I was smarter than that. I would be careful. Strategic. Measured. I wouldn't risk what I already had for something uncertain. That sounded reasonable. It also quietly hollowed me out. I learned early that loss hurts more than emptiness, or at least that's what I believed. Losing something meant pain with a name. Emptiness felt abstract, manageable, almost respectable. You can function with emptiness. You can't function when something is ripped away. So I chose emptiness. I didn't call it that, of course. I called it stability. I called it balance. I called it being realistic. Every decision passed through the same filter: what could I lose if this goes wrong? Not what could I gain, not who could I become, just what would disappear. That filter kept me safe. It also kept me small. I stayed in situations that felt wrong but familiar. I avoided commitments that could expose me to grief. I diluted my desires until they sounded practical enough to justify keeping them distant. People described me as grounded. Sensible. Someone who didn't chase illusions. Inside, I felt like I was standing still while time practiced leaving me behind. The strange thing is, nothing ever collapsed. That's what made it so difficult to see the damage. My life didn't look broken. It just looked contained. Carefully limited. Designed to survive, not to expand. I didn't lose everything. I lost intensity. I lost urgency. I lost the feeling that something mattered enough to risk pain for. And because nothing dramatic happened, I kept going. Years passed quietly like that. I accumulated routines, explanations, reasons. I became very good at defending my choices, especially to myself. I could explain why every door I didn't open wasn't worth opening anyway. That skill felt like intelligence. It was avoidance with vocabulary. I told myself people who risk everything often end up with nothing. That love fades, dreams collapse, identities shatter. I told myself caution was wisdom and restraint was maturity. But late at night, when there was nothing to distract me, I felt something unsettling. Not sadness. Absence. I realized I had very few memories that carried emotional weight. Plenty of events, yes, but very few moments where I had felt fully alive. Where my heart had been involved. Where I had been exposed to the possibility of loss. I had protected myself too well. I started noticing something about people I admired, not the successful ones, but the alive ones. They had stories marked by loss. By mistakes. By moments that hurt but mattered. Their lives weren't smooth. They were textured. I envied that texture more than comfort. The realization crept in slowly, and I resisted it at first. Maybe I was just restless. Maybe this was midlife noise. Maybe wanting more was selfish. But the thought wouldn't leave. What if I had avoided loss so successfully that I had also avoided meaning? That question frightened me. Because it suggested that the emptiness I felt wasn't accidental. It was the price I had chosen to pay. I hadn't lost everything. I had avoided having anything worth losing. And for the first time, I wondered if that bargain had been a mistake I could no longer afford. Once I admitted that fear of loss had been my guiding principle, I couldn't unsee it. Every cautious decision suddenly lined up into a pattern that was impossible to ignore. I hadn't been unlucky. I hadn't been misunderstood by life. I had been consistent, relentlessly consistent, in choosing the option that required the least emotional risk. I called it protection. But protection from loss is also protection from attachment. And without attachment, nothing has weight. I began to notice how shallow my investments had been. Not financially, emotionally. I stayed just involved enough to participate, just attached enough to escape if things went wrong. I never let myself fall fully into anything that could hurt me if it disappeared. Relationships stayed safe but incomplete. I cared, but not recklessly. I was present, but not vulnerable. I always left myself an exit, a mental clause that said I can survive without this. At the time, that felt empowering. Now it felt empty. I realized I had never truly risked being changed by anything. Not by love. Not by purpose. Not by a belief strong enough to disappoint me if it failed. I had skimmed the surface of experiences that demanded depth, telling myself depth was optional. It isn't. Depth is where meaning lives. Without it, everything feels replaceable. And when everything is replaceable, nothing feels necessary. That was the quiet tragedy of my life. Nothing was ever essential. I noticed how often I dismissed longing as impractical. How quickly I talked myself out of desires by imagining worst-case outcomes. How easily I accepted less than I wanted because it guaranteed less pain. I had trained myself to settle. And I had done it so early, so subtly, that I mistook it for character. The turning point didn't arrive with drama. It arrived with comparison. I watched someone I knew lose something they loved deeply. They were devastated. Unsteady. Changed. And yet, even in their grief, there was something unmistakable about them. They had lived. They had held something tightly enough to feel its absence. I realized then that I had been afraid of that pain not because it was unbearable, but because it would prove I had cared. And caring meant exposure. I felt a strange kind of envy watching them grieve. Not for their loss, but for their courage to have something worth grieving. Their pain was terrible, but it was earned. Mine was quieter. Mine was the pain of avoidance. I began to understand that loss isn't the opposite of having something. It's proof that you did. And I had been trying to skip that proof my entire life. The fear intensified when I saw how little there was left to lose. My life had become so carefully minimized that even imagining loss felt abstract. I hadn't built anything that could collapse loudly. That should have felt safe. It felt terrifying. Because it meant my life could end without anything ever truly falling apart. No heartbreak. No dramatic failure. No defining moment. Just a slow fade into irrelevance. I started feeling late. Late to passion. Late to risk. Late to discovering what mattered enough to hurt for. The idea that I might reach the end of my life having protected myself from pain, but also from meaning, shook me deeply. I imagined looking back at a life with no real losses and realizing that was the greatest loss of all. For the first time, I questioned the belief that had guided me for decades. What if loss isn't what destroys you? What if avoiding it does? That question didn't make me brave. It made me restless. I could feel something inside me pushing against the walls I had built. A quiet urgency. A sense that staying safe had stopped being safe. I wasn't ready to risk everything. But I was beginning to understand that risking nothing was already costing me more than I could afford. And somewhere beneath the fear, a dangerous thought started to form. Maybe the life I was trying so hard not to lose was already gone. I didn't suddenly become fearless. I became honest. Honest about what my caution had taken from me. Honest about the bargain I had been making for years, safety in exchange for depth, stability in exchange for meaning. I had convinced myself I was protecting my life, when in reality I had been protecting myself from it. The moment I decided to risk something real didn't feel bold. It felt late. I remember noticing how my hands shook, not from excitement, but from unfamiliarity. I wasn't used to wanting something enough to risk losing it. Desire felt dangerous because it implied attachment, and attachment implied grief. But for the first time, grief felt like proof of life rather than a threat. So I let myself want something fully. Not cautiously. Not with an exit plan. I stepped into it knowing it could disappear. Knowing it could fail. Knowing it could hurt me in ways I had spent years trying to avoid. The fear didn't fade. It clarified. I felt exposed in a way I had never allowed before. Every moment mattered more because it could end. Every choice carried weight because I couldn't pretend it was replaceable. I realized something important then. Loss isn't what gives life pain. Attachment does. And attachment is also what gives it meaning. When things began to change, when uncertainty turned real and the possibility of loss stopped being theoretical, I didn't retreat. I stayed present. I let myself feel the anxiety instead of numbing it with distance. I allowed joy to exist without immediately calculating its expiration date. I felt more in a few months than I had in years. And yes, there was loss. Not everything lasted. Not everything survived the exposure. Some things I reached for slipped through my hands despite my effort. I felt disappointment sharply, without the insulation I had always relied on. It hurt. But the pain was clean. It didn't come with regret for not trying. It didn't come with the quiet shame of avoidance. It came from having chosen something and standing by that choice even when it cost me. That pain didn't destroy me. It anchored me. I understood then what my fear of loss had really been about. It wasn't about suffering. It was about responsibility, the responsibility of admitting that my life mattered enough to be shaped by my own decisions. Avoiding loss had allowed me to avoid that responsibility. Risking loss forced me to accept it. I don't romanticize this shift. Risk doesn't guarantee happiness. Attachment doesn't promise reward. Some days I still feel the old impulse to pull back, to minimize, to protect myself by caring less. But I know where that road leads. It leads to a life that survives without ever being lived. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself, someone who has built a careful life, a safe life, a life with very little to lose, I won't tell you to abandon caution. I'll tell you this. Ask yourself what your safety is costing you. Ask yourself what you've avoided wanting because wanting makes loss possible. Ask yourself whether the absence of pain you've protected is worth the absence of meaning you've accepted. I spent my life afraid to lose everything. So I lived in a way that made sure I never truly had anything. When I finally allowed myself to risk loss, I didn't gain certainty. I gained substance. My life stopped feeling hollow. It stopped feeling interchangeable. Even the moments that ended mattered because they existed fully while they lasted. Loss didn't ruin me. Avoiding it almost did. I don't know what I will lose next. I don't know how much pain lies ahead. But I know this now, I would rather lose something I truly held than protect myself from pain by never holding anything at all. That choice didn't make my life safe. It made it real. And for the first time, real feels worth the risk.